But here's the piece that just is always buzzing right there. If I don't adhere to the belief that you do, my children burn. And you're okay with that. Either you're okay with it personally, or you bend the knee to somebody who is okay with that. That's the insult.
Sometimes the question is not, does God exist? It's, is God good in the first place? The issue is not so much the truth of God's existence, but if it would be a good thing were God to exist. This came up in an interview that Sean McDowell did with comic book legend Todd McFarlane. McFarlane's an atheist, but he didn't seem interested at all in discussing the truth of God's existence. His whole focus was to say that he wouldn't bend the knee because he didn't think that God was good. I think that there is only one view of God that's worth believing in. And by the way, I'm not going to just say the biblical view of God, so hang on to see what I mean by that. Hey, if you like this content, please hit subscribe and like and share and whatever else you want to hit down there. I would greatly appreciate that. Okay, so Todd McFarlane drew Spider-Man in the 80s and 90s, co-creator of Venom, and then he went off and did his own thing and created the comic book Spawn. Now there's a bit of nostalgia here because I grew up in the 80s and 90s and I was a comic book fan for a time. And so I very, very fondly remember reading Spider-Man and X-Men during this time. I remember my brother and I, we would ride our bikes down to the convenience store when the new issue was coming out. And so I probably read Todd McFarlane's Spider-Man. So there's definitely respect here. But this interview is all over the place. It's a bit of a mess. It's hard to see a single argument that McFarlane develops and sticks with. Sean does a great job at trying to keep him on track, but we just kind of go all over the place.
But to be in a relationship with a holy God, we have to enter into, on, you might say, God's terms, so to speak, rooted in his character.
Why?
Because God is holy.
Why?
And God is just.
The peace. Oh, man. That's the peace. Why the ego, God? I actually hope, can I tell you, Sean?
Sure.
I hope I am dead wrong. I hope someday I get to meet this maker of yours, because I'm going to have a conversation with this person. And at the end, I got to tell you, Sean, even if somehow he says, Todd, I know you. I've known you since, I know this is how you, come on in. I'm not going in. There's nothing that could get me to go into his glee club. Nothing. Ever.
What do you think his glee club is like and people doing there?
I'm going to come up with rules. If you don't adhere to my rules, you're not good enough for me. The God of love has now got a criteria.
He calls him the ego God, right? This is where God has all these rules, and if you don't follow the rules, then, right, that's it for you. You're going to burn. Maybe he would agree with Richard Dawkins that God is a capriciously malevolent bully. Now, I want to start with some common ground. I actually agree that if that's who God is, then I don't think we should bend the knee to that God either. I just, of course, don't think that's what God is like. Okay, so here's what I think is going on here, right? People grow up sort of surrounded by cultural Christianity, where God is kind of my homeboy. He's kind of there to forgive me of my sins, to support me and help me along the way, right? And then we kind of look around the world and we see all this pain and suffering and misery and so on, and it just doesn't gel. Right? Those two things just don't go together. And so you can kind of see how Todd McFarlane, I think, or a guy like him, would come to the conclusion that, yeah, maybe God's just not good. Maybe he's a malevolent bully. But ultimately, I think this is just a too small version of God. I think it's just too thin. At one point in the interview, he says that he thinks that God should be like 7-Eleven.
If he was as good as what you guys said, that would be like a 7-Eleven. and that thing would be open 24 hours a day. Come in, come all, warts and all, come on.
I think he just means like open 24 hours and people can come and go as they want. But it was just such a bizarre kind of comparison. Again, we just have too small of a God. I think if we're thinking about God, we've got to blow God up to God's size, and it actually handles a lot of these issues. Now, I'm not going to take Todd McFarlane to task in all of this. I try to focus my videos on when scholars are objecting to some part of Christian theism. But I want to offer 3 thoughts that I think will be helpful in thinking through an objection of this sort when someone is objecting to the goodness of God. The first thought is to understand that God is much bigger. He's much, much, much bigger than we can possibly imagine. He's not a malevolent bully, but he's also not this like 7-Eleven God. Like both of those are too small. Go bigger. You have to think bigger than that. Here, I think philosophy has something to say about this. So if we go to the 11th century with the philosopher Anselm, who was a Benedictine monk and eventually became the Archbishop of Canterbury, he defines God in a particular way. He defines God as that than which nothing greater can be conceived, right? Sometimes called the greatest conceivable being. So he's that big. He's so big that there's nothing greater that can be conceived. Right? He's the greatest. He's the greatest conceivable being. Now, I think this is one of the most important philosophical concepts in the history of philosophy, actually, is understanding the bigness, the immensity of God, the greatness of God. And of course, Anselm famously uses it as a kind of argument for God's existence. I can give you the gist of it. It's that God is so great that he can't not exist. He's too big to not exist. So if that's right, if we've sort of blown God up to this the greatest conceivable being, then we wouldn't expect always to understand God. And I think there's even this sense in which there's something terrifying about the greatest conceivable being. So maybe we would even say that God is not completely safe when we have that big of a view of God. Here's what I mean by that. This is a C.S. Lewis reference. So in the Chronicles of Narnia, actually in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, Susan expresses concerns about meeting Aslan because Aslan is a lion. And so she asks, is Aslan safe? Is it safe to be around a lion here? And Mr. Beaver says, safe? Who said anything about safe? Of course he isn't safe, but he's good. And I just think that's a pretty powerful picture in a way, because what we should expect of the God who is so great that's, beyond our comprehension great, is that God wouldn't be necessarily safe. It wouldn't be necessarily neat and nicely packaged always for us. I think that's the God of the Bible. I think it's the God of the Bible is the living God, right? It's the God who comes to Moses in a burning bush or blinds the eyes of Saul of Tarshish on the road to Damascus. Blaise Pascal, when he had an encounter with God, the one word he used to describe it is fire, right? This is the living God. This is the God who is the greatest conceivable being. He's not the 7-Eleven God, right? He's not the Sky Daddy God, but he's also not the malevolent bully God. He's bigger than that. He's untamable. He's uncontrollable in this sense. But here's the thing, he's good. Why? Again, Anselm would say, because that's part of what it is to be that than which nothing greater can be conceived. He's perfect in goodness. He's maximal in goodness. So while he is so big and beyond comprehension and in that sense somewhat unsafe, he's good, right? He comes to us as good, and our good can be found in him. The second thing here, I think, is that we underestimate our own fallenness, the fallenness of humanity, right? McFarland, even at parts in the interview, describes humans as basically good. I just don't buy it. I think that we all are focused inward. We're focused on self. I think we're just selfish creatures. The test of this, too, is that when someone gets in power, when someone has the power to do terrible things, they very, very often do those terrible things. I don't think it's because the power just corrupts that person. I think that we just are fundamentally corrupt. Most of us just don't have the opportunity to let that corruption really, rise to the surface and go wild. So we are very, very fallen. And now contrast that again to the bigness and the holiness of God. I think that's our situation. It's not that we're kind of like almost even with God and we're basically good and God is good. It's that there is such a disparity between where we are at from a moral perspective and where God is at in his holiness. So we underestimate how fallen we are. And thirdly, I want to suggest that we overestimate our ability to judge whether God is justified in a particular case. What I would suggest is that we need intellectual humility. Again, given God's immensity is sort of underlying all of these considerations. Given how big God is, we're just not in a good position to judge whether or not God would be justified in allowing any particular case. For that matter. I think a good analogy here to capture the disparity between God and humans is something like the disparity between parents and children. Think of the most common refrain that kids will have over and over again is, "That's not fair," right? "What? I can't have ice cream for dinner? That's not fair." Kids will very often feel like it's not fair, but they just don't understand because they don't have the minds of adults. Or consider a situation where the parents have to make a tough decision to move, right? And the kid has to say goodbye to his friends, his teacher maybe, is just a situation that's comfortable. It can almost feel like the parents are torturing that child, right? And again, from their perspective, that's the way it feels. And I think that's just often the right way to think of our situation. At least it should lead us to be humble, intellectually humble about it, to not act like we understand the mind of God in allowing, again, admittedly, from my perspective, some really, really crazy things that have happened in history, that have happened in friends and family members around me, and that have happened in my own life. I'm not saying I've got that all figured out. I'm not saying I know why God allows those things to happen. That's the point of intellectual humility. I'm saying I don't know. But here's the thing. I don't think Todd McFarland knows either. I don't think any of us know. And so we can't conclude that God doesn't have good and justifying reasons for allowing kind of the craziness of history. He's, again, so big that he could have good and justifying reasons. We just don't know what those are, at least in the kind of particulars of the case. So for me, as I think about this issue, I'm with Anselm. I would define God as necessarily good. You can believe in a being who is evil or fails to do the good at times, or maybe a God of limited power. I just don't think that that's God. I don't think that's what we mean by God. I mean a supreme being. And I mean that in the very literal sense that he is the greatest conceivable being, who has all great-making properties and is thereby worthy of worship. Because if God is somehow falling short of that, then I don't think God is worthy of worship at the end of the day. God is maximally great and worthy of worship for that reason, right? He is the good. And he is our good, and our design is to aim at him. Like we find our good, we find our fulfillment when we are aimed at that properly supreme being, the properly greatest conceivable being, right? We find a kind of peace and fulfillment. And I actually think that's a really beautiful picture. So I'm really committed to the idea that if people could just get that big conception of God, that immense conception of God before their minds, they might still reject him. I think that's still possible, of course, to reject him, but I don't think that they would do it as flippantly as Todd McFarlane does in this interview.